Hi, my name is Betsy Cañas Garmon. I'm an artist and coach and have created a workshop called Soul Cartography. I'm really excited today to be here with my friend, Dr. Jerome Lubbe, and we're going to have a conversation about the neuroscience of journaling.
First off, I'm so glad to be in the conversation with Betsy. It's always a privilege, and she's pioneering awesome work, so I'm so glad that you guys are joining in. Just a little background of what I do. I am known as what's called a functional neurologist. That's my board certification, and I specialize in unresolved cases. So kind of like tuning a piano or working with complex instruments in an orchestra, I am able to know how the brain works, all of the pieces that are involved, all of the resources, and be able to not only rehab but also optimize brain function, specifically without drugs or surgery, through practical applications like journaling, through things that seem abstract, but you can innovate by connecting seemingly unrelated areas to get really powerful and effective outcomes for soul care.
I love it. So my first question for you is, every time you talk to a therapist, a productivity coach, entrepreneurs, anybody who has an opinion about how to be successful, they always have journaling on the list. So I'm really curious, why is journaling on the list for success?
It's a great question, Betsy. I think the first thing to understand with journaling is the key with it is it has to slow you down. And in Western culture, especially when we're talking about being successful and we're talking about what does it look like to practice soul care and self-care, one of the biggest challenges is to find a legitimate and realistic and practical way to slow yourself down enough to even change the nature of what you consider natural momentum. Journaling does that. Journaling is a very powerful way to go, I have to be present. And when you look at a lot of the folks that are doing the work around leading a company or leading a family, the nature of entrepreneurship is doing something that no one else has done in a space that no one else has gone. So if you're married for the first time, you're an entrepreneur in your marriage. If you're the first person to go to college, you're an entrepreneur in your family. I think a lot of times we think it's tied to business. So the reason so many people in business are finding it to be so effective is because it's helping you to slow down, and more than anything, you have to be quintessentially present. And when you're present, pen or paintbrush or whatever medium you're using on paper, you can't necessarily be in 10 other places at the same time. And as you're working through that process of constantly getting distracted, you're still physically in a space where something's in hand, something's in front of you, and it can keep bringing you back. So it's powerful at not only keeping you present, but also minimizing and mitigating distractions to the degree that you have practiced and gotten familiar with it.
So slowing down, why is that important for our brains? Why does being present and being mindful and being with a practice matter for our brains?
Yeah, it's a really interesting concept that if you look at the really core basic piece of what every neuron needs to survive, that's tied to it. And here's why. Every neuron, you have 1 trillion neurons in your system, right? There's tons and tons of neurons. Every neuron needs 4 things. They need activation, like stimulus. They need oxygen, like breathing. They need fuel, which is every nutritional resource that we do or don't put into our body in whatever degree that we do. But then the 4th thing is you need a lack of inflammation, or a subdued version of inflammation. And that's basically when your cells are wrestling through stress, so decreased stress to a degree. So we can drink all the water that we want, we can sleep well, we can eat well, we can move well, but to rest and to practice self-care, the biggest thing that it accomplishes is an anti-inflammatory process. So if you slow down and you rest and you give yourself a chance to have a break, what you end up doing is you take some of the employees in your brain and in your system and you reallocate resources to garbage disposal and triage and recovery and vacation time. Because if we thought about it from a normal everyday standpoint, from an employee-employer relationship, no one is designed to work 3 shifts. No one is really designed to work 2 shifts long term, and no one's designed to work a really long single shift for an extended period of time. So when you get into a space that you start to journal, what ends up happening is you give your body a chance to clock out early from the tasks that require a different part of your brain. You put them into a space where they're now going, okay, what does it look like for me to be contemplative? What does it look like for me to be introspective? What does it look like for me to produce and create art in a medium that is tangible and practical and physical? And those are all different parts of the brain. But simply put, the biggest thing is it's going to foster a different type of intentional rest or anti-inflammatory process, which is actually healthy from an intracellular microscopic neuron-based level, which is powerful.
Oh, I love it. So, a part B to that question would be, does it matter if I use pen and paper or if I type, if I'm gathering my thoughts and my words?
You know, it's interesting. A lot of the times I think in these sort of practical ways that we try to engage in a practice, we try to forecast or predict what is going to be the most ideal version, what's going to be the most effective, what's going to be the most efficient, right? And here's kind of the process that I work with my patients that I connect with that are asking these big comprehensive questions of what's going to help me feel better, what's going to work, right? Is a lot of it is tied to understanding, it's tied to technique, it's tied to engagement, it's tied to consistency. But more than anything, the biggest thing is, have you created an environment where you've increased your likelihood to engage on a regular basis? Mm-hmm. So it's not first and foremost the medium or the mechanics or the technique. It's first and foremost, what are you willing to consistently step into on a regular basis that feels inviting, feels safe, feels comfortable? So when you're looking at the difference, for instance, a typewriter or paint or whatever the medium may be, I think it's about finding a nice healthy blend between pushing yourself outside of your comfort zone, but still maintaining a high degree of safety where you can be vulnerable and you can be honest, but not necessarily looking for consistent comfort, because that doesn't activate the healthiest part of your brain, which is the muscle that has to work through trauma or fear or safety or overcoming or being transparent. So the short answer I would say is to spend some time navigating what feels best for you and what feels most comfortable for you to initially allow you to step in, but then don't steer completely away from things that might make you slightly uncomfortable, because that's where a lot of growth happens.
I love that. So Jerome, in this course that I've created, we are really ultimately in pursuit of personal growth and spiritual formation and self-awareness. And one of the things that I've discovered is that there are parts of all of those processes that are incredibly difficult. So backing up and creating safety as we engage with all of those different contemplative practices and practices that are inward focused, so that people don't shut down, we've created all different sorts of techniques that allow people to take a breath and actually be with the information. Can you talk about why, as humans, we want to push against the information that's actually going to cause growth for us?
Yeah, it's probably the most quintessentially baseline component of engagement in everyday experience. Mm-hmm. It's important to understand that your brain doesn't know the difference between perception and reality. It doesn't know the difference between if you're running late for a flight at the airport or somebody pulls a gun on you and you're in a fearful situation. Your brain 100% of the time is going to filter information through, is this going to increase my likelihood of survival? As a result of that increased likelihood of survival, am I going to move closer towards safety? And after that, am I going to move closer towards self-gratification? So there's a couple of pieces that are nuanced there that connect with what you're talking about with the journaling. First, what is self-gratification? Self-gratification has two primary components: pain avoidance and pleasure seeking. And they're very primal, and they're very subconscious, and they're very tied to, is this going to increase my likelihood of seeing tomorrow and being satisfied and happy? Is this going to increase my likelihood of tomorrow because I avoided something dangerous and painful? So that's the nature of how our brain is filtering things. What's going to make me safe? What's going to help me survive? And after that, is it going to continue to minimize my pain and increase my pleasure? Those are all subconscious mechanisms. So when we're getting into journaling, one of the things that you're asking people to do on a regular basis is you're asking them to be vulnerable. And the root word of vulnerable is vulna, and in Latin that means to be woundable, right? So you're asking for transparency and you're asking for vulnerability. As people do that, they're going to be bringing things up that are saying to them, gosh, I haven't thought about this in ages, or I haven't spoken to somebody about this, or I haven't processed this. Whatever the varying degrees or layers of complexity and intensity and emotionality that's involved in that, the brain is constantly going, is it real? Is it going to hurt? Is it going to make me feel good? And to what degree, right? So when you start doing journaling and you start doing this work, being aware that your brain is asking these questions constantly can help you to stop when you're in a situation and you go, I just wrote something down and it may have even been a single word. The word just came to mind, it reached conscious level, and now all of a sudden I'm getting flooded with things that don't make sense and they don't connect for me. Why am I so incredibly impacted by this single word, right? And when you're in those spaces and you start to go, okay, what does it look like for me to be present with the moment, be present with the experience, and to go, maybe I don't have clarity on why, but I'm starting to recognize that that's happening. I'm sensing the change in my body. I'm sensing the change in my emotions, and moving into different places where you can start to reason that out and connect it to the bigger picture of soul care and self-care.
So part of this practice that I love the most is that it combines both verbal and non-verbal techniques. So it allows the parts of our brain that don't have language wrapped around them to have some way of gaining expression. Can you talk about what happens in our brain? Like, does our brain use English?
That's a great question, especially being raised on different languages and Daddy spoke 13. Yes, your brain uses a lot of languages. It's a really interesting perspective to take when you're talking about these. I think a lot of the times when we're doing creative work or we're doing artistic work, we've been sold this idea that that's a right brain process, and that to be an intellectual is a left brain process. Well, the nature of every human being on the planet, the fact that we're having this conversation means I have two halves of my brain that I'm actively using, right? If I am a right brain person, you didn't lose the left half of your brain, and vice versa. So when you're doing this kind of work, one of the things that's important to understand is the way your brain is set up is very similar to a regular company structure. You have an executive team. That executive team has a CEO, a COO, a CFO, all of these different executive level team members. And they have millions of employees that work for them downstream. Think Steve Jobs, the executive team, and everybody that works for Apple, right? Just a huge network. But now you have to realize that you have a right company and a left company that together have an incorporation, and that's the entire brain. So if the mission and the goal of your company is to have really healthy, effective, productive outcomes, and you only use one executive team when you have two connected and available for the entire incorporation, it's not that you won't produce powerful things, it's that you're not utilizing everything you have capacity for. And when you do the journaling, what you're actually doing is you're leveraging both, especially when you have the opportunity to think abstract and you're just doing watercolor with no specifics at all, right? And then you have finished this beautiful piece and you add a single word to the center of that picture. Now you've gone from the right brain, creative, abstract, conceptual piece, and you've given it context and you've given it language. Because the right brain is the one that deals with nonverbal emotional cues. It's the one that deals with abstract and creative thinking. The left brain deals specifically with verbal cues. 98% of people on the planet have what's called Broca's and Wernicke's area in their left brain. That's the one that hears speech and then expresses speech. So receptivity for words and expressive nature for words. 98% of people, that word center is on their left brain. This is why a majority of people learn to talk at 2 to 3 years old, because that's when the left brain is coming online. So an analogy or a comparison that I use that's very effective for the work that you guys are doing in this space is a lot of people think artists are right-brain people. They're not. They're both. And the reason being is there's a difference between the tortured artist that's struggling to ever produce art and the artist who's prolific. And the difference is one came up with the idea and then practically executed and produced that idea. So the idea itself from concept creation is great, but to put pen to paper, to put paintbrush to canvas, to type it out, to actually produce it line by line, note by note, stroke by stroke takes the left brain. The right brain is the big picture. The left brain is the linear step-by-step sequence of the actual accomplishment and the execution of it. So when you go through and you do this kind of soul care and this kind of work with journaling, what you're ending up doing is not only giving yourself the space to non-verbally intuit what it is that you're trying to create and manifest, but then you actually use the left brain to say, okay, what does it look like to practically create that in a tangible way that lets me hold it in my hand, step back and reflect on it in meaningful and detailed ways. So it's both intuition and intellect.
One of the things that I noticed early on when I was working with young art students, and then it actually translated to my adult workshop participants, was that what was happening at the table when we were creating was actually reflective of their real lives. So challenges that they had in the creative process were actually the same challenges that they were having out in the real world.
Yeah.
Why is that?
Yeah, it's interesting. This is a really big concept in neurology that's been proven, but it'll connect to both your question and also why there's so much effectiveness to consistently practicing this type of work, right? There's two sayings that I use with the patients that I work with about how they've arrived, where they've arrived, and why they're so efficient at sometimes not feeling great or struggling, and then why it's so important to manage and engage on a consistent basis when they leave, because we want to change what they're efficient in, right? What they're used to or second nature. One is called Hebbian theory, which is a theory in neuroscience that says neurons that fire together wire together, which basically means if your brain has a consistent conversation in a consistent space, it will actually change that from an executive function at a CEO level or an executive team level to an autopilot function that's just part of the manufacturing process. So if you do it consistently enough, it becomes second nature instead of primary nature. It becomes habitual rather than intentional, because it has to be intentional before it becomes habitual, right? It has to become primary nature before it's secondary nature. The other one is practice makes permanent, not practice makes perfect, because perfect is a misnomer, okay? The nature of practice makes permanent is that you want to be able to say, okay, I've done this enough times. That the visual that I give people is imagine that you're in the middle of a field that has never been walked through, where the grass is 6 feet high. It's taller than you are. I'm 6'2", so I wouldn't even see it, just be at my hairline, right? The grass is so high. You walk through that field once and you turn back around and you look at it, you can't tell where you've walked because it's all stood back up again. But if I walked that same field every day for a year, I would have a new pathway because it's become permanent, because I've bent that grass down to the point that not only can I recognize where the pathway is, but I don't have to do it as consistently for that pathway to remain open. That's the way the brain works, right? So when we're doing these kind of processes and you're talking about all of these pieces, the reason that somebody is coming into that kind of medium and they're doing the work and they're bringing their life into it, it's because as soon as they get into an emotional, intuitive, or even an intellectual space and they start to hit a trigger or they start to hit something that resonates, right? Because a trigger can be a negative, a resonation, or something that's resonant can be positive but powerful. So as soon as you strike a chord, good or bad, in your system, all of a sudden it reverberates through your entire neurology and everybody on deck goes, am I supposed to respond? Is this real? What are you asking me to do? And all of the ancillary things that come in with, why did I just taste that food and remember my childhood? Why did you say that in a tone that reminded me of my dad? Why did I put this down and all of a sudden had the visual of what it felt like to be 15 and get kissed for the first time? It's because your brain is automatically going, I don't have a sense of time, I only have a sense of purpose and connection. So as soon as I have that moment where something resonates, good or bad, you've just pulled in an entire group of other employees in the manufacturing process to go, what are you asking me to do? And what are you asking me to make? And more than likely what I'm going to do is do what I've been told before until I'm told otherwise. So as you start processing, you start journaling, and you start to feel yourself get elated, then what does it look like to reinforce that? As you start journaling, you start doing this work and you start to get anxious and you start to get uncomfortable and you start to bring in those outside influences that are negative. How can you pause and reframe that to say, okay, this is not a relived experience, it's a remembered experience. This isn't the chance to get secondary trauma, re-traumatization, it's a chance to reflect and go, this is a part of my history, not a part of my present. So in those spaces, the reason it can be so powerful is because your brain is firing off on things that have been pre-wired pre-wired that you can rewire because of neuroplasticity. And it's trying to say, what are you asking me to make permanent? Because I've had a lot of practice in this space in the past. And then you get a chance to, as the CEO and as a person with executive function and powerful control over your system, you have a chance to go, that's healthy, I'd like to reinforce it, or that's unhealthy and I'd like to replace it.
All of this makes me very curious about the self-awareness piece. I want to know, as humans, can we really be self-aware, especially when it comes to these parts back here that function subconsciously? A big part of what I teach in the course is creating a rhythm in your journal keeping where you are collecting, and then reflecting.
Yeah.
So not editing yourself, spilling, pouring out, observing, collect, and then reflect.
Yeah.
How does that all line up with the neuroscience?
God, there's so much that lines up with the neuroscience and that we could talk for days on it, especially when you talk about collect, reflect. One of the things that I talk about with the families that I work with, especially when I'm working with, for instance, nonverbal autism, and it applies to every human being on the planet when we talk about fear and safety, is your brain is filtering, is this going to be consequential? Are you going to hurt me? Am I going to get hurt? And if there's a freedom and a space to vent and to move in that arena and say, okay, I can be as transparent as possible without the consequence. What if your kid was able to say whatever they wanted in any language with any words that they ever wanted, free talk, and they go, okay, I can be as transparent with you, but this is not going to end up being discipline related. Your brain is internally going through that process. It's asking, how truthful can I be without there being a consequence? And sometimes, if there's the appropriate nature, which is what you're teaching people how to do that in healthy ways, sometimes it's not about filtering. Sometimes it's about cathartic processes of getting it out and being able to go, okay, how can I step back and reflect on that? And here's where the journaling is really heavily connected to the neuroscience from the practicality of it. When you pointed the back of your brain, I laughed because at the back right here, inside your skull, is this structure called your cerebellum. And your cerebellum is like your executive assistant to your CEO. And you have two halves. So you have a left executive assistant that communicates with the right CEO. You have a right executive assistant that communicates with the left CEO. So there's lots of crossover. Again, why you can't be a left or a right brain person, because everything's intersecting, right? So what ends up happening, if you know anybody in a company, a good CEO can't do it on his own. He has to have a good executive assistant. And what the executive assistant is doing constantly is making the executive aware of the environment, because all the executive can do is make a very powerful and effective decision based on the resources and the information that have been given to him or her by their executive assistant and their support staff. That's what your body is doing all the time. It's trying to bring stuff to your awareness to go, hey, need help. And a healthy CEO goes, oh, that is somebody screaming for help, I should help. Or that's somebody going, hey, can we celebrate a win because we just crushed it? And you're like, nope, head down, gotta work. Or I'm on vacation for the 17th time this year while everybody's dying. It's really, really good for the CEO to be aware of everything that's happening downstream. But here's where the neuroscience comes in that's super fun. The cerebellum is primarily responsible for a lot of things, but there are 4 factors that it's responsible for that I want you to think about as you're journaling, okay? It's responsible for fine motor coordination, specifically fingers, tongue, and body movement. It's responsible for fine motor coordination of your thoughts, your speech, and your emotional real estate subconsciously. So when your cerebellum is working and you're doing fine motor movement with your hand, you're also exercising the brain, a part of the brain that helps you to coordinate thought, coordinate speech, and coordinate emotional regulation subconsciously. It's basically like if somebody told you when you're learning to ride a bike for the first time and you're stumbling all over the place and it becomes smoother, you've actually also exercised your cognition, your emotional regulation, and your speech centers. So when you start doing therapy, or art therapy, or you start doing journaling, and you're doing anything with your hands while you're processing, it isn't necessarily something that requires clarity cognitively or clarity emotionally. It doesn't necessarily require all of that. It just requires you to start to kinesthetically engage in that space, and as you do that, it's going to start bringing things to awareness in the CEO, and as you start moving in that, especially with your fingers, and especially with your thoughts, then all of a sudden it'll pull somebody in to the board meeting and go, hey, do you realize that actually connects very heavily to this moment? And the CEO is going to go, you know what, I wasn't aware of that, but now I'm aware of that, let's talk about it. So from a really high level perspective, when you're doing art therapy, you're putting everybody who's involved with speech, cognition, emotional regulation, and also the production of the art kinesthetically into the same conversation at the same time, and helping the CEO to go, I should probably be aware of that. What do we do next? So it's a great primer for being able to step back after you've collected, produced, and then you go, okay, what does this mean to me, and how do I reflect in that space, and what do I do with it? Because self-awareness at the end of the day, more than anything, is becoming aware and then asking questions. Because the last thing I'll say is there's a really good saying that my older brother uses that's very true neurologically, which is you can't both be curious and scared at the same time. So when you're fostering self-awareness, a lot of the times you're just trying to ask yourself, well, what does that mean? And if you start to increase curiosity, as cognition goes up, fear goes down. So being in those spaces where you keep being intentional about not only creating but also rationalizing what that means from a really intentional space, incredibly powerful for brain health, physical and mental and emotional real estate in terms of being healthy in all those spaces as well.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah.
So this information is really allowing us to make the connection between journal keeping and the expansion of emotional intelligence, self-awareness, and solid decision making. So Jerome, if people want to find out about you and your work and all of the exciting things that you have coming up, where can we go to find out more?
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate it. The easiest URL to go to is drjerome.com, which is just DRJEROME. That'll forward you to the landing page that has my clinical site, which is Thrive Neurohealth, if you have a question for me as a clinician. It also goes to Thrive Neurotheology, which Thrive Neurotheology is work where I do publishing and content creation in similar spaces to Betsy is, okay, where does neuroscience meet practical application in self-care? What does it look like to try and figure out how to live life in a healthier, more optimized way, even if I don't have a significant health issue, but I want to be conscientious of my physical, mental, and emotional health for the purpose of spiritual well-being. So if you go to drjerome.com, you can find all of the resources and the community engagement that we have there.
Thank you so much.
You're so welcome. Thank you.
And thank you guys for being with us. Appreciate it.